the history of the Nigerian legal system, prior to 1963, we had the West African Court of Appeal, we had the Federal Supreme Court, and we had the Western States Court of Appeal. Okay, the West African Court of Appeal was a court that existed up till 1954. It was a court that it was a court of appeal for the West African states of Gambia, Sierra Leone, the Gold Coast, and Nigeria, and a few that where the appeals went from these countries to the West African Court of Appeal. And then from the West African Court of Appeal, the appeals were taken to the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council in England. So the West African Court of Appeal was more or less a court of appeal, intermediate court of appeal between the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council in England and the Supreme Court of the states of the West African states. Now, this court was disbanded in 1954, and the Federal Supreme Court took over by that particular year. So you will find out that since we now have a system where the Supreme Court is the highest court in the land, followed by the Court of Appeal, it's important to find out how the Court of Appeal will treat the judgments of the West African Court of Appeal. Now, it's been suggested, for example, by Nicky Toby in his Works of Nigerian Law, that since the West African Court of Appeal was an intermediate court of appeal between the Privy Council and the Supreme Court in Nigeria, that it's also important that the Court of Appeal should treat the judgment of the West African Court of Appeal as its own judgment, because right now in the country, the Court of Appeal also stands as an intermediate court of appeal between the High Courts and the Supreme Court, and so it should be able to treat the judgment of the West African Court of Appeal as its own judgments that are convincing, and it can depart from based on those principles that we saw in Young and Bristol Aeroplane Company. If it's paying Korean, if it can't stand with the Supreme Court. And so that's the suggestion that has been given by Nicky Toby on this. Then as of the issue of the Federal Supreme Court, when this court was set up as well in 1954, you will find out that it continued, appeals also went from the decision of the Federal Supreme Court to the Privy Council, which appeals stopped actually in 1963 by virtue of the Republican Constitution, but the Federal Supreme Court was still an intermediate court, just as because it replaced the West African Court of Appeal. And it's the same principle of, it's actually in the case of Samia and Bauchi Native Authority, the court had actually pointed out that the Federal Supreme Court and the West African Court of Appeal were actually the same kind of, on the same level. And so based on that, the same suggestion has been brought out that the Federal Supreme Court and the Court of Appeal should treat themselves as this court doesn't exist anymore, but that the Court of Appeal that currently exists should treat the decisions of the Federal Supreme Court as its own judgment as well. Then for the Western States Court of Appeal, this court was set up in 1967 and disbanded in 1976. It operated for the Western States, and it took appeals from the High Courts of the Western States, and then the appeals will go from there to the Supreme Court. So it was also not strictly, like Nicky Toby pointed out, it was not strictly a court that was on the same level with the Court of Appeal currently as it is. because it took appeals from the High Court of just only the Western states, while the current Court of Appeal takes appeals from all the states of the Federation. However, he suggests still that the Court of Appeal of current Court of Appeal should treat the judgments of the Western states of the Court of Appeal as something it should be persuaded by, materially influenced by, but that they are not strictly courts on the same level. So, having said that, these are just suggestions basically that have been brought in by Justice Nikki Toby of blessed memory in relation of how and also Obilade also talked about those things. And Obilade also talked about this being the state of the law about these issues. Then the other issue should be how do the courts in Nigeria actually handle the decisions of English courts? Well, again, if you look at Nikitobe, he gave us a lot of academic discussions that have gone along, that have actually been done by various writers like Park, like Obilade, like Ezejiofor, like Asamoah. And if you want to look that up, you can read Sources of Nigerian Law by Nikitobe. He gave us those arguments, but basically the most important point you need to note, which he also summarized, is that Nigeria is a sovereign country. Even though Nigeria was formerly under Britain and we still operate the common law system, but under international law it is a misnomer for one state, an independent state, to be subject to the courts of another state. It's a violation of the sovereignty of that state that is recognized even under the Charter of the United Nations. So by virtue of that, it's suggested, and it's actually the common thing everywhere, that the courts of England, even though we operated under them, cannot bind the Nigerian courts because they are not part of the hierarchy of Nigerian courts, and as such the decisions can only be persuasive. They cannot be binding on the Nigerian courts. And then the same thing with other courts, other countries that operate the common law, even other countries that you can borrow from. They can persuade the Nigerian courts, but they cannot bind the Nigerian courts, because Nigeria is a sovereign state that has its own hierarchy of courts. So that basically concludes the discussion on the operation of precedent and case law in Nigerian courts. And remember that when we're talking about precedent, we said that the importance of having those courts is to ensure that the operation of binding precedent works accurately. So the next thing we'll look at is the use of the law reports in order to ensure that the binding precedents actually work well.